You think you know the people you sleep next to. I found out how wrong that can be the hard way. These are 3 separate nights, 3 different cabins, 3 moments when the wood smoke and the quiet did not protect me. They amplified whatever was waiting just beyond the lamp's halo. I say this as someone who sought cabins out on purpose. I liked the silence. I liked the distance from city noise and the way a pine forest made the rest of the world feel very far away. I also learned that distance sometimes makes the ordinary stranger into something much more unsettling. There's a thread through all of them. The loneliness that comes with a creaking house and a long, dark yard. The weird power ordinary people take on when the rest of society is several miles down a gravel road, and how little you can actually know about anyone who suddenly becomes part of your weekend. I've told these stories in pieces to friends and at parties. I'm telling them now as straight as I can remember, because I still think about them, sometimes in the middle of the night. Story 1. The new girl. She had a knife in her bag. We drove home with it beside us in the back seat and didn't notice until it was too late. We'd booked the cabin as a getaway, the 4 of us, a weekend with a wood stove and board games. Randy was my best friend since college. Stacy was my girlfriend then, quiet, sharp, the kind of person who notices when a picture on a wall is crooked. The plan was simple. Escape the city for a couple of days, drink too much coffee, hike, sit by the fire, and play dumb games until we cried laughing or got bored enough to go to sleep. Then Randy broke up with his girlfriend 2 weeks before the trip, and in what felt like a last-minute fix, he showed up the day everyone was supposed to leave with someone new, Lucy. She was small, all bundled in a cheap jacket that didn't fit her right, and quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Randy introduced her like he was announcing dessert. "This is Lucy," he said, like he was offering her to us. She smiled the polite smile and sat down like the rest of us were a surprise she'd been coached to accept. For the first evening, it was normal enough. The cabin smelled like wet wool and wood smoke. The lamp threw a low orange halo over the coffee table. We played Uno because the deck was easy and forgiving. It's dumb to say a card game can be the start of something, but the card game is what we remember because the strange behavior began there. It started as an overreaction to a reverse card. Lucy's hand went stiff. She snapped at Randy, the kind of sharp, personal thing that didn't fit with the small talk she'd been making. Randy laughed it off. I remember the sound of the card slapping onto the table. It seemed too loud in that close wooden room. She shouted, not angrily, so much as with a tone that made someone else's name sound like an accusation. After that, she decided to tell us things. None of it asked for. She told Randy's business like she had access to it, the job names and where he'd been the night he broke up with his ex. She told me, in a way that was meant to be friendly, that she liked being around people she knew the edges of. It was like she was describing a safety checklist without anyone asking. At dinner, she overshared. A story that ended with her saying casually that she doesn't like unfinished things. She smiled as she said it, and because you're in a room with other humans, we shifted in our seats and made small noises to move the conversation forward. There was a fight later that night between Randy and Lucy. I was halfway asleep on a couch that creaked whenever you breathed too loudly, when the yelling started. The cabin has thin walls, board and a hollow that makes even whispered words sound like they're being shouted. Usually couples argue, and it's the kind of thing you can dismiss. Nobody wants to be the person who knocks on the door at midnight. But Randy's voice changed. It went flat, as if someone had turned down the color in his sentences. When he said, "You can't stay here," it wasn't the ordinary, "this isn't going to work" voice. It was final, quiet, like he was closing a file. I remember walking by the bedroom to see the shape of Lucy standing at the foot of his bed, like a photograph pressed against glass. She wasn't at the foot in a gentle way. She was there looking at him with that same small, steady smile, and the room was ice cold, even with the stove still warm. Randy's bed had the kind of thrift store blankets that make a dull thumping sound when people shift on them. The moment was simple and terrible. She was there. He was shocked. He told me later he thought she'd gotten up in the night, but when he checked, she was not in the hallway. We found the knife. It wasn't dramatic, at least not in the way horror movies make it. I lifted the blanket because Randy asked me to check, thinking she might have left something. Under the thin thermal blanket was a zippered purse, the kind that passes for a bag and is mostly canvas, and in the open top, a folding knife with a black handle. I remember holding it and feeling stupid. It looked smaller than the imagined kitchen knives, but then you realize how small things can be sharp. Randy grabbed it like a reflex, the way someone grabs a steering wheel, and went into a very short, breathless kind of anger. He shoved it into a jacket pocket and said we needed to leave. Lucy left the cabin naked for the temperature outside. I say naked because she had only on that flimsy jacket and slippers. The first snow had started, and the air was the kind that stabs the lungs. She walked past us and didn't seem disoriented, didn't seem to be in any hurry, just moving like someone who belonged where she was going. Randy ran to the door and called after her, but she kept going into the trees as if she had a purpose. He followed her voice for a few yards until he couldn't see her. Then he came back pale and small, and he put the knife on the kitchen table like it was a relic or evidence. He wouldn't let any of us go out to pull her back. We drove the whole trip home with the knife in a jacket beside Randy and the heater blowing like a failing lung. The road was a ribbon of black through white. There was an odd quiet that felt like it was boiling. Randy kept checking the mirror the way people do when they're waiting for something to happen. We didn't call the police that night. You can imagine why. The charges, the embarrassment, the question of what was real and what wasn't, when everyone had been drinking and tempers were high. Instead, we made it home and put the bag and the knife into a closet like you put away a memory you aren't ready to unpack. The next day, and for the days that followed, Randy tried to find Lucy online. He checked social media the way people do, scrolling for a face or a name that matched the things she'd said. We searched the few messages he had for any contact info. As far as I could tell, there was nothing. I tried the same. I typed her name the way he'd said it into search bars and found profiles that might have been her and profiles that weren't. Sometimes people change names or hide. Sometimes people don't exist beyond the way they fit into a story for one night. There were 100 little ways we tried to explain it. Maybe she'd been a stranger drawn to warmth. Maybe she'd been drunk. Maybe she had some life that made sense of the way she'd stood at his bed. Randy and I argued about the knife. He insisted we'd found it under the blanket. I tried to remember exactly how it looked and whether I'd seen anything else. We looked for her license plates in the dusty photos we'd taken by the fire. Nothing. I remember peeking at the security footage from the cabin owner's rental website. We had permission to, because we were freaking out, and that was the sort of thing you do when you think you might need evidence. But the cameras were wired to the front entrance and showed nothing more than anonymous headlights. If she'd come and gone like a ghost, we had no proof. For weeks, the idea hovered over me like a winter fog. I kept thinking of the way she smiled when she said she didn't like unfinished things. There's a certain cruelty to that sentence because the implication is she was coming to correct something in someone else's life. I thought about how people move through your days with a bag and a face, and how easily you give them access to yourself. I learned that night how little it takes to unsettle you permanently. Randy stopped answering scattered calls from people who tried to track Lucy down. He stopped posting as much. He avoided places we used to go because the world had a familiar cadence with a misplaced beat. Stacy and I tried to make light of it at first. We told each other we were being paranoid, but paranoia and common sense are thinly separated, especially when a stranger has left a knife in your friend's bed. I checked public records the way you hope you never have to. A clerk's office, a few county databases that let you search property and arrest records. There was nothing that matched Lucy's details. Nothing in jail logs, nothing in the small local news. If she ever had an identity I could find, it wasn't visible where we looked. Sometimes people aren't on the grid. Sometimes they are. But the name they use in one small town is different than the name they use in another. A month later, I drove past the rental sign for that cabin when I had to pass the area for work. The road felt smaller. I told myself I was being ridiculous when a shiver ran up my arms. The memory was not clean. Details chunked together, bright playing cards, the thud of wood, a face at the window. I tried to catalogue everything precisely, the way you might write down where you put a will. But some things were fuzzy. That's the part that nags. Memory is a lens that scratches as it focuses. I still wonder if we overreacted. I also still sleep with the knife far, far away from my bed in my imagination. After that weekend, I stopped trusting new people as quickly. I kept an eye on Randy. We agreed, without saying it out loud, to keep our distance from the part of our lives that helped us relax. It stays with you in small, structural ways. The way I check the backseat of a car now, the way I make sure somebody knows which cabin number I'm in. Ordinary precautions, I think, but they were born from that tiny, loud moment of finding a knife in a bag. If you like real cabin horror, stick around. I've got 2 more. You'd think a cabin would harden you against fear. It does the opposite. The quiet gives your imagination room to stumble into dangerous ideas. After Lucy, I kept thinking about how someone can be right beside you and still be a question mark. You can live with someone and only know small, polite gestures, and every now and then, when the wood stove is low or the phone has no signal, that lack of full knowledge becomes a piece of terror. Story 2. The Man in the Suit. I used to go alone on purpose. Cabin time was my therapy. No obligations, no small talk, no expectation. The first few times I realized how restorative it could be. I would park at the edge of the property and just sit for a long time, listening to the woods breathe. The idea of someone else's company felt like a weight rather than a gift. I liked coming back to myself with a mug of reheated coffee and a book that I only skimmed during the morning light. The outing that turned bad began like all the others. I drove a narrow, hours-long stretch to a rental that sat thin along a ridge, far enough out that the GPS sounds tired trying to calculate where you are. It was late fall, the maples were skeletons, and the road had that cold, hard edge. I threw my bag into the cabin like a man who expects to stay and then leave without anything shifting internally. I hiked a path I knew, the kind that crosses itself after a while and makes you less certain of exact direction. I remember the gravel crunch and the way the sun went red through the trees, and the small sounds. A twig snapping far off like a door being closed, a coyote or a dog calling somewhere downstream. It's easy to tell yourself there's always a plausible explanation when you hear something at the edge of hearing. That day, something followed me. I was coming back down the trail late, my legs burning and the light falling like a curtain, when I heard boots behind me. Not a distant set of feet, but measured steps that matched the rhythm of my own. I stopped, thinking someone behind me would pass on the trail where the brush was thinner. I turned and saw no one. The woods were awash of greys and browns. The path was a pale line. Somewhere off the path something shook leaves loose, and I kept thinking it was an animal. I shrugged it off and walked on. The sensation of being watched crawled up my back, but I've got a restless brain that makes mountains out of molehills, so I blamed the setting sun and my imagination. I kept the hike short and walked faster. My breathing sounded like a small engine. By the time I reached the cabin, my head was full of static. The night fell and settled in the way nights do in the country. Heavy, thick, the silence punctuated by the stove's low mechanical cough. I locked the doors. There was a habit to setting up for the evening. Kettle on, lamp dim, a playlist that was mostly ambient. The phone lost signal the way it sometimes does there, which makes the silence feel like a claim on you. I told myself I'd drink tea, read a little, and sleep early. Then, A knock at the door. It was hard, polite knocks rather than pounding. A late knock at a cabin is the kind of thing you notice, the way a wrong note sticks out in a song. I thought maybe the owner had some reason. A neighbor, a delivery for another property down the lane. The clock read 11 p.m. I opened the door, and there was a man. He was clean cut in a way that didn't belong where we were. Suit, dark and pressed, hair combed like someone had a mirror they were practicing for. He stood in the porch light like a photograph from a different life. His face was unremarkable, but it had a sort of blankness that made it more memorable than any face full of character. He looked at me and tilted his head slightly, like a man waiting for a cue that I didn't have. "Hey," he said, "are you by yourself?" His voice had a rhythm that could have been rehearsed. I told him I was. He said he was looking for a girlfriend. He claimed she had walked off during a hike. He said it like a man reading the names on a missing persons list without emotion, more a fact than a plea. There's a brief exchange I replay in my head. The polite lies you tell a stranger at 11 p.m. The man said he'd come down from a rental farther up, his car parked somewhere I couldn't find in the dark. He asked if he could come in for a second to warm up. It's incredible how quickly you can anticipate the right answer. The right answer in that moment was to say no. Instead, I found myself doing what decades of social practice taught me, inviting him to sit on the porch for a minute. Looking back, it was indecision made dangerous by habit. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He didn't seem cold. He didn't seem particularly worried. He asked my name. I told him. My name left my lips and was like an object you had no idea you'd handed over. He said it back with an odd, slow emphasis, like testing the sound. Then he laughed. Not humor, not a chuckle, but a thin laugh that didn't touch the eyes. It made the porch light seem dimmer. Things accelerated in a way that's hard to capture unless you were there. He started making small, circular movements with his hands, like a man trying to ward off a fly. He laughed again, then knocked on the window and leaned forward. His face pressed at the glass, and the shape of his nose and mouth looked distorted, as if he were watching a movie where his image had been stretched. He called my name. The way he said it, slow and knowing, felt invasive. It was like someone else had a map of the inside of my head. I should have closed the door then. Instead, I found myself close enough to see the fine stubble at his jaw, the tiny line of a scar above his eyebrow I would have missed if I weren't standing so near. He stood there and then leaned his forehead against the glass, breathing in short, shallow pulls that fogged the inside of the pane. I remember being overcome by a mix of anger and cold. I felt ridiculous for being frightened, and that made me angrier. The man smiled without moving the rest of his face and said, with absurd calm, "You shouldn't be out here alone." I called the police. The manner of it was that clumsy, fumbling thing you do when you don't expect to have to talk to the authorities. My voice sounded stranger on the line than I expected. I gave my location. I explained who was at the door. The operator asked me if I was in immediate danger. I didn't answer in a way that felt truthful. I said the man had left. Then, very quickly, he didn't seem to be leaving. The porch light showed the shadow of his hat like ink. Then his breath fogged the glass again. By the time an officer arrived, the man was gone. The patrol car's presence made the cabin buzz with a new masculine electricity. Radios, flashlights sweeping like mechanical search parties. They took my statement, wrote down the make of the man's suit, asked the shape of his face. They asked if I wanted to press charges or make an official report. I said yes, because what else do you do? And then I remembered later that what I was asking for wasn't justice. It was a reason. The officer left a while after, polite but a little distant, the kind of distance people put between their work and the way shadows can keep following you home. I slept in a motel that night with the curtains pulled tight and a light on in the bathroom because the idea that someone had stood at my window was too large to shake. That wasn't the end of it, though. In the morning, my car tires were slashed. It's the small physical violation that matters. You expect a break-in to be loud and dangerous. You don't expect your tires to be quietly deflated like a metaphor. I remember seeing the flat and thinking for a beat that maybe the man in the suit had nothing to do with it. Maybe it was a raccoon or bad luck. But the timing felt too close. I called the officer back and told him what I'd found. He wrote down the facts, made the little noises on the police radio, and told me he'd patrol the area when he could. The landlord, who had a tendency to apologize before you could form a complaint, came by and offered a refund for the night and the number of a tow. He said he hadn't seen anyone who matched my description, and that in a place like that sometimes things happen that don't make sense. The phrase, "people do odd things out here," kept getting used. I was told someone probably didn't want anyone to leave their camp at night and thought slicing tires was a harmless form of property rearrangement. The officer didn't seem to think anyone had been actively following me in the long term, but he admitted he didn't have a lot to go on beyond my statement and the ruined rubber. Even afterward, there was a sense that the man had left an imprint on that weekend. I couldn't help picturing him in the headlight beam of my car, in the dim shape of the window, in the way the porch felt colder after he'd been there. The rational part of my mind told me these things could be explained. Maybe he was a drunk who'd gotten turned around, maybe someone with a grudge. Maybe none of it was directed at me. But the other side, the part that kept turning the photograph of events like a Rubik's Cube, looking for the side that would line up, said the man had known my name before he spoke it. The idea that someone could call you by name and mean something more than casual civility is eroding in a way that leaves you half paranoid and half prepared. I left the cabin that night and didn't go back alone for a long time. I made a rule, no solo stays unless the place had a security system or other people on site. My anxiety had a new notch carved into it. The fear of someone who shows up clean and ordinary, because ordinary people have the hardest faces to read. It's one thing to hear a noise in the dark and imagine a monster. It's another to see someone at your window, struggling to make something human out of a grin, calling you by name as if to invite you to a conversation you never asked to have. In the day, it feels like paranoia. In the night, it feels like a lesson. That night, with my tire slashed and the image of a suited man sticking at the edge of my vision, I learned two things. People can follow the shape of your life without you noticing, and the quiet of a cabin makes every ordinary intrusion feel enormous. I was back in my car, engine idling outside a small motel, thinking I'd done enough by calling the police and sleeping with the curtains drawn, when my phone vibrated in the seat beside me. It was a text from someone I hadn't chatted with in months. Not a call, not a local number, just a name on the screen. The message was only 2 words. Be careful. I froze. The motel lights hummed. The brakes sighed. The text had no sender attached that helped. It was the kind of message you want to kind of laugh off and file away with the other things that make sense only in an inventory of fear. But when you have something that already feels like a bruise, the smallest touch hurts worse. I looked up the number and it was a message gone through an anonymous relay. I thought about calling the officer again, about staying another night in the safety of strangers and fluorescent light. I thought about calling Randy or Stacy and telling them I might be overreacting. Then I put the phone face down and looked out at the dark and realized I couldn't go back to the way I'd been before. The cabin had taught me that lesson and done it with an unkindness I felt all the way down to my bones. I decided to drive at dawn. I would go back in daylight, make repairs and collect my things. The minor heroics of morning light do a lot for courage. But the first person I saw on the road up to the cabin that morning was an old man who waved as if he'd known me for years. He didn't look like someone in a suit. He looked small and harmless. He pointed up at the ridge and gave me directions I didn't need. It was the most ordinary moment, and it made me realize how much the edges of fear depend on context. A suit can mean a professional. A man at a window can be a tourist asking for help. But context is not always kind, and sometimes it twists itself into a story you don't want to live. I should have left when I saw his suit the first night. I should have refused the conversation at the door. I should have driven straight to town and waited under neon. But most of us are built a little generous, or at least a little lazy, with our instincts. We give second chances and reasons and explanations because that's how we learn to coexist. The man in the suit taught me that giving someone an extra chance can be the kind of choice you regret for a long time. I drove up the rutted lane, the motel behind me, and pulled into the cabin's small drive. The morning light made the world look forgiving. The porch was empty, the window was intact. I told myself, out loud, with the hubris of someone who plans to be brave, that the only thing left to do was check the tires and head home. I had a plan to get a tow later and call the rental company. I told myself this was over. That was the part of the story I wanted to believe. I walked to the car and reached down to check the tire pressure with my hand. My fingers found nothing but cold air. The morning held its breath and then exhaled with the slow certainty of things that are not, in fact, over. I kept my hand on the hood and looked up at the cabin as if it would offer instructions. The porch steps were shadowed. The front light clicked faintly in the breeze. There was no man in a suit in sight. But then, at the edge of the yard, a dark shape moved between the trees, too deliberate to be an animal and too quick to be a neighbor. I couldn't tell if it was walking away or coming closer. My heart did that stupid lurch it always does before you decide whether to run. I picked up my phone and dialed the non-emergency line. As the number rang, the shape stopped and turned. For a second, I thought it might just be someone living in the area, an old man watering a garden. But the figure stepped into the road and began walking my direction, in that way that makes you realize you are now part of someone else's plan, or at least their observation. I put my phone away and held my hand under the lip of the driver's door, where the car key could be an anchor. I had no idea if I looked composed, but I felt messy and unpracticed. The figure's pace didn't quicken, it didn't slow, it just kept coming. Up close, a suit's form means nothing. Up close, faces are what matter. I squinted at him, and because the morning was bright, I could make out some features. A collar, a tie, the flash of a shoe. He lifted his hand and tipped an imaginary hat. He smiled. "Funny to see you again," he said. My mouth went dry. The gloves I imagined on my hands slipped through my fingers. The man in the suit had the kind of tone you use when you're trying to remind someone they've forgotten a debt. It was casual and full of purpose. I stood there and watched him come closer, thinking stupidly that I had time. I didn't. That's where I leave it for now. The morning held space between the tire and the figure and the ringing phone, and for the first time in a long time I felt the cabin's quiet squeeze me into small decisions, the sort that you can't undo. I didn't. He was a step away from the car when something inside me flared into motion. It wasn't courage so much as a small animal calculation. Keys, lock, engine. I gripped the key, thumbed the remote, and the lock clicked. The man's smile didn't change, but the angle of his head did. The tilt that said he'd expected me to freeze or to invite him in. Instead, the car alarm chirped once, and the world rearranged itself into motion. My foot on the brake, the car pulling into gear, my hand slamming the door shut. He didn't rush. He watched me the way someone watches a scene close up while planning the next cut. I backed out slow enough to keep my composure, faster than felt safe. He didn't make a move after me. He stood and watched me go, a figure framed by the trees where the light turned into shadow. When I passed, he raised his hand in that small, polite salute, a gesture so ordinary it made the moment feel like a bad practical joke. I drove without looking in the rear view until I hit a stretch of blacktop and could breathe without waiting for a sound to tell me I'd been followed. I called the officer I'd talked to the night before. My voice was tight. I don't think I sounded like myself. He was awake, he said, and he agreed to meet me at a gas station down the road. When I stopped, My hands were shaking so hard, I texted Stacy and Randy a single line. "I'm leaving. He's here." The officer sat in his car for a long time, with the dome light on, writing something that might have been a report and might have been a small attempt at structure for an otherwise messy thing. He took my statement. The man in the suit had appeared the night before, had stood at the window calling my name, and now had found me in the morning. I told him about the flat tire, the text that read, "Be careful," the way the man had said, "Funny to see you again." He nodded, careful and professional, and told me he'd put an extra patrol up on the ridge for a while. He didn't sound surprised. The tone officers use when they've heard this sort of thing before is a warm, worn fabric. It comforts you a little because it knows what to say, and it unsettles you because it means the problem is not unique. He asked if I wanted to stay in town. I said yes, and the officer drove me back to the motel under high beams and the small, saturated hush of the early morning. He said he'd watch the cabin while I packed. He wasn't under any illusion that he could prevent everything. He said things like, "We'll do what we can," and "keep your phone charged." Those phrases were a kind of soft armor you put on when the real armor isn't available. The man in the suit never set foot in the motel. That's not something I can claim with the certainty you want when the world is raw and small and vulnerable. He might have. He might have driven past and seen me and decided for whatever reason that the story he wanted had ended. All I had was what I remembered, and the little collection of proofs, the slashed tire, the ring of footprints in the soft shoulder of the drive, the way the porch light had been on when I came home the night before, and then cold in the morning. I filed a report, more of a ritual than a cure. The officer who came out that night took statements, wrote down license plate numbers of passing cars, and circled the map with a pen like he was trying to fix the space where the incident had happened. He said that in rural areas, people come and go. Strange things happen. We traded hypotheses that I could have made up stories about. A prank, a troubled traveler, a misidentified neighbor. I kept trying to line up his words with the picture I had. A man who knew my name before I ever said it aloud, and a handwriting of small actions that looked less like a one-off and more like a shape. In the weeks after, the memory kept folding into itself. I checked with the rental company. They were apologetic, offered me my money back, and told me this had never been reported for that property before. The owner asked me if I wanted to rent another cabin in a different location, and when I said no, he sounded both disappointed and unsurprised. If you've been in that line of work, you hear a lot of people with slightly damaged stories. I checked the police blotter online. There were reports of trespassing on other properties in the county, of vandalism that never made the national news, nothing that tied directly to that man in a suit. A friend of mine, someone who likes to think problems have tidy, legible causes, suggested I had been mistaken about the man's knowledge of my name. Maybe I'd given it away in the conversation. Maybe he'd overheard me when I'd been at a different place. Maybe I was narrativizing. I can't deny how easy it is to make patterns where none exist. That's what the human mind does. We assemble threads into blankets to keep from feeling cold. But then there are the small, stubborn facts that sit like stones. The way his breath fogged the window, the laugh that didn't touch his eyes, the timing of the tires. Those are stubborn little things that refuse to be explained away. Months later, I still feel the echo. I stopped taking solo trips without someone else booking the same property. I sleep with my keys in my hand for a while after getting into a new place, and I check the windows twice before turning the light off. Those are small, mundane changes, the sort you wouldn't expect to be revolutionary. But if fear is a sequence of tiny, persistent edits to the way you move through the world, then the man in the suit rewrote a paragraph of my life. Some people would tell you to be brave and to reclaim space. Some would tell you to avoid forever, to be safe and fortified. I learned a compromise. Be cautious without being ruled. It's not a heroic line, it's a practical one. After that morning, every time I heard an unannounced knock, I felt the hair along my arms stand straight. The cabin had taught me again that ordinary people with ordinary faces can be the ones who unsettle you the most, because they come with plausible explanations and empty smiles. You think you can see danger coming. Often you can't. Often danger looks like a man who knows your name. I don't have a tidy ending for that one. He didn't get caught, and he didn't make a move that allowed me to point and say, "There, that's the thing that happened." All I have is the scar that comes from knowing someone could have known where I was and might have been willing to come find me. The scar is small and domestic, a new set of boundaries, and the occasional flinch when a stranger calls my name. If the first story taught me that you don't always know who you share a bed with, and the second taught me that a stranger knowing your name is its own kind of invasion, then the third taught me that sometimes the real terror is someone living inside your life, in your attic, in your closets, while you pretend it's empty. Story 3. The Attic Tenant. My father's cabin smelled like old paper and cedar. It had always smelled that way to me, a smell that was a combination of my childhood and the slow decay of anything left to stand outside seasons. He used to come up here in the summers and spend weeks working on the porch or fixing the roof. The cabin was his retreat and my inheritance by the odd arithmetic of family life. When he died, I didn't think I would sell. I thought I'd fix it up and visit. It took one trip and a night of sound to change all that. I drove a trailer full of what felt like the rest of my life. Some furniture, boxes with my father's books, a record player that hadn't worked in years, and a half-used bottle of varnish. The sky was low with cloud, and the road felt longer than it had been when he was alive. I remember the radio cutting out and the way the trees closed ranks around the narrow lanes, as if they were ushering me into a pocket of the world I'd only visited as a guest. The first day was all cataloguing. What to keep, what to toss. The floorboards made their old complaints when you walked on them, and dust rose in thin curtains when I opened drawers. I found a shoebox with his old letters and sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor, reading things that felt like both his voice and mine. That night, I slept poorly. The bed unfamiliar in the way of places that hold other people's steam and sweat. In the morning, I woke to a smell that made me dizzy, a wet rot that wasn't quite mildew, a sourness that lived in the beams. It was the kind of smell that insists on being noticed because it carries with it a story you can't ignore. I stood in the kitchen with a mug of coffee and the clouds bent low enough to press the light flat. There was a note of something else, tangy and sharp, and a sound like fabric rubbing fabric that made me stop mid-sip. The attic ladder had been pulled down. My father had an attic, a low crawl-space sort of place where he stored things he didn't want to throw away. Holiday decorations, a box of his fishing tackle, a couple of quilts. The ladder was wooden and stiff with age. I'd used it before, when I was a kid, half afraid of spiders and half excited by the idea of forbidden space. Now, standing in my father's kitchen, I watched the ladder hang at an angle and dust drift down like old confetti. The smell was worse near the mouth of the attic. It hit me full and made my eyes water. I thought at first it was animals. A raccoon in a shed will make a house stink. I thought it could be a dead thing, small and tragic. The sensible part of my brain, the part that wants a label for everything, started listing plausible things. Then I heard it, a movement above, slow and deliberate, like someone shifting a blanket. I remember a memory from when I was 7, crawling into that space with my flashlight and a cookie, imagining I'd found treasure. That memory snapped into place with the present in a way that felt absurd. The attic was not where you expected a person to live, but as I stared at the ladder, the idea moved from improbable to possible. What if someone had been hiding there? The smell, the muffled sounds, the blanket of dust. It all lined up. I pushed open the trap and climbed. ladder creaking under my weight like an old man complaining at a hike. The space up there was a low cathedral of boxes and old coats. The light from my phone made the dust glitter. At first it was just trash. Newspapers yellow with age, a coffee can full of nails, the kind of bric-a-brac you accumulate if you expect things to have another use someday. Then toward the back, I saw the outline of a blanket on the floor, and beneath it a small rise like a sleeping shape. Something moved. It was a soft shuffle, a rustle, like a creature turning its head. I froze on the ladder, the wood pressed into the soles of my shoes. The attic felt too small and too full and too close, like a mouth. The blanket shifted again, and a boot stuck out from under the edge, a scuffed piece of rubber that suggested someone had made a bed of the attic floor. I remember thinking that I would be embarrassed if it was a hobo, and asking him to leave would be awkward. And then the air smelled of people so strongly I had to step back, because the idea of someone living in my father's house had a wrongness to it that went beyond property. I called out, "Hello? Is someone up there?" My voice sounded tinny and small in the hollow space. The shuffle stopped. For a second, there was a silence so thick I could hear my own pulse. Then the blanket peeled back and a face, not fresh, not clean, skin marked by the roughness of a life spent half outside, looked at me. He was small in frame, mangy in his hair and beard as if grooming had been a low priority, and he had the kind of stare that felt like a puncture wound, direct, unblinking. I could tell he was scared and tired in the same breath. He did not speak at first. He didn't try to be charming or violent. He just sat up, wrapped himself tighter in the blanket, and sat on the attic floor like a person who'd decided to be invisible for as long as possible. I did the only thing I could think to do. I climbed down, closed the attic door, and retreated to the yard like someone who stepped into a neighbor's argument and chosen to make themselves noticed. The man bolted out of the cabin before I could form a sentence, and for a moment he was outside in my yard, like a shadow given rough edges. He stood there and looked at me. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply held his place. "Don't come near me," he said, voice low and cracked as if the words themselves had been slept on. He had that look of menace that doesn't need action, a kind of quiet intensity that makes you invent ways for things to go wrong. I got in my car and locked the doors. It was a reflexive, childish gesture, but one that steadied my nerves. He stood at the edge of the yard and made no move to leave. I called the local police and told them there was someone living in my father's cabin. The operator on the other end was polite and asked me the usual questions. Had he threatened me? Did I know him? Was anyone injured? I answered as honestly as I could. My voice didn't sound the same as the one that told stories to friends. It sounded closer to the person someone calls when something private is breached. By the time the officer arrived, the man was gone. That was the phrase that would come again and again in my head. Gone. Because it made the scene both solved and unresolved. The officer looked around with a sort of comfortable detachment common to people who have seen the wide range of human choices. He suggested the man had likely been squatting, that he'd been there a while, and that the smell probably came from improper waste and the general neglect of an occupied space. The officers took photographs and wrote down my statement. They found signatures on a few boxes where someone had left a crude label, and they poked into the attic with a flashlight and a stick. No one was arrested. The man hadn't been violent. He'd fled. The official language was careful, measured, designed to avoid promises and to document facts. The officer told me, as they often do, that in rural areas this kind of thing is sadly not unusual. People take advantage of empty houses or homes in transition. He suggested I hire a cleaner and maybe a lock change. I didn't want to go back inside for a few days. The idea that someone had been inside my father's things, rifling through boxes or making a bed of old coats, felt like a violation on a level that had nothing to do with money. It was about intimacy. A home is an inventory of small secrets, A cast of your life assembled in teddy bears, letters, receipts, and little ornaments that mean nothing to anyone else. Finding someone living among those things felt like someone had read your private mail and then slept in the bed you'd made after you left. I hired a cleanup crew. They wore masks and gloves and treated the place like a crime scene without the drama. They hauled out a truckload of rotten furniture, the kind of pile you didn't want to look at closely. They cleaned the attic, sealed it, and put a new lock on the door. I paid more for the work than I expected, not because it was necessary, but because I indexed the cost to how much I wanted the house to be empty again. There was a moment when the crew left and the front door slammed behind them, and the cabin looked like it had been scrubbed out of the past. But it didn't feel clean to me. It felt like a place moth-eaten of a previous life. I put the property up for sale. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself I didn't want to turn my father's memory into a source of grief and maintenance. I told myself other things that sound reasonable in the daylight. The truth is, I didn't want to sleep with the knowledge that someone had made a home inside his things. There's a difference between using someone's space with permission and inhabiting it while they're gone. It felt like theft of a kind that no insurance policy could replace. After the sale went through, the cabin changed hands, and the scent that had lived there faded like an old film left in the sun. The new owners did the sort of refurbishment that feels like an exorcism. New paint, new windows, a tidy porch set with chairs meant for guests who meant no harm. I drove by once, months later, and the house looked like a postcard. I felt a small stab of relief and an equal-sized hollow at the center of me, an odd sense of mourning, not for the house itself, but for the version of the life it represented. What stayed with me, after all of it, wasn't the idea of a stranger who might be scary. It was the knowledge that people occupy places you assume are private. They move into the margins of your life and live there with the quiet dignity of survival, or the desperate recklessness of someone who had nowhere else to go. I couldn't say which category that man fit. The records didn't give me his name. The officers didn't have a prosecution, and the community file had only a cold notation. In the end, I had a pile of bills, a cleaned-out cabin, and the decision to sell. Aftermaths and patterns. 3 stories. 3 small dominoes that fell and left me carrying a set of behaviors as a result. I stopped doing what I used to do without thinking. I checked the back seat of my car before I got in. I stopped accepting spontaneous knocks at midnight. I hired friends to be my backup when I had to stay anywhere off the grid. I moved out of the habit of assuming there would always be plausible explanations for strange behavior. There's a loneliness to these changes that I admit to sometimes missing. The quiet I loved when I first sought cabins, the sort of solitude that felt like a recharge, but the kind of solitude I learned to dread is not restorative. It's a pressure cooker that amplifies men who should be ordinary and makes the ordinary seem monstrous. That's the core of the terrifying thing about cabins. They turn small things into enormous ones. I did what anyone does when they want answers, but no, there aren't many. I called, I searched, I filed. I checked social media for Lucy and came up with nothing. I filed a police report for the slashed tires and got a report number with a neat string of digits that meant nothing. I checked the property deed for my father's cabin and found no records of other claims. I asked neighbors and owners and was told variations of a local truth. People move through here. Sometimes they leave tracks. In the quiet hours, though, the patterns reveal themselves more clearly. The people who unsettled me were not uniformly monstrous. They were ordinary. A woman who smiled too steady and left a knife in a bag. A man in a suit who could alter the tone of a night by leaning his forehead to the glass. A mangy person who'd made an attic his bed. There's a lesson in that. It's not that everyone is dangerous, it's that anyone can become dangerous when context, isolation, or desperation shifts them into another role. The final thing that changed after all this was how I speak about caution. I stopped saying, "Trust your gut," in the breezy way you hear on social media. Trusting your gut takes practice. It takes listening to the small signals your body gives you and having a plan for what to do when those signals get loud. For me, that meant never traveling alone to isolated rentals without at least one check-in, making sure someone knew where I'd be, and sometimes choosing the slightly more populated option, even if the romantic part of me wanted the empty cabin. Epilogue. There are nights when I still wake and replay those three scenes. The card slapping the table, the suited man at the window, the blanket across the attic floor. They are different kinds of fear. One domestic and interpersonal, one invasive and knowing, one a violation of sanctuary, and each taught me something about how fragile the line is between comfort and danger when you remove the buffer of community. If there's a single thing I want you to take away, it's this. Cabins don't create danger. They strip away the layers that usually keep ordinary things ordinary. That can be beautiful, contemplative, restorative. It can also magnify a small, misplaced thing into something that cinches your ribs tight. Pay attention. Make plans. Don't assume because someone looks harmless that they are harmless. Don't assume because a place is quiet that it's safe. And if you've ever had your own night that made you think twice about being alone, tell me, which of these three messed with your head the most? The woman who smiled and left a knife in a bag, the man in a suit who called your name at the window, or the person who moved into your attic and turned private things public? Comment below with your vote. Share the one that unsettled you, and if this kind of thing interests you, like and subscribe. I've got more stories and I promise I'll tell them straight. Be careful out there. The quiet is a nice thing to seek. Just don't confuse it for safety.